Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. One of my favorite smaller devices is the Miyoo Mini Plus. I've made a bunch of videos about it, but I've never actually sat down and made a complete starter guide. So that's what we're going to cover here today. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the entire experience, what it's like right out of the box, but then also how to improve the software with two of my favorite custom OS options. And finally, after that, we'll talk about some of the accessories and mods that you have available as well. So if you're brand new to the Miyoo Mini Plus or just any other handheld in the first place, I think this video is going to cover everything that you're going to need to know. And to make things even easier, I have a full written guide on my website, which I'll have linked in the video description. So I do expect this video to be a little bit on the longer side just because we're going to cover every single topic, but it'll all be timestamped if you want to jump around. Anyway, I think we're going to have a great time getting your Miyoo Mini Plus set up, and so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, your first question might be, what is the Miyoo Mini Plus and what can it do? And you know what, that's a great question, so let's go ahead and start there. Well, the Miyoo Mini Plus is a perfect storm when it comes to retro handhelds. It's small enough to be pocketable and has a nostalgic form factor and is also not too expensive. Now, out of the box, this can play a number of systems, including your favorite handhelds like Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, and so on. When it comes to home consoles, it can play all the classics up to PS1. It's also pretty great at older arcade emulation, including Neo Geo and the older Capcom games. Now in this guide, I'm going to show you how to install an operating system called OnionOS. And the great thing about this one is that it will expand the type of games that you can play by a bunch. And so here's a more comprehensive list of all the game systems that you can play on the Miyoo Mini Plus when running OnionOS. So when it comes down to it, most of your old favorites all the way up through PlayStation 1 are going to be playable on this device. Now there are a lot of places you can buy the Miyoo Mini Plus, but these are the three that I'm recommending right now. The most direct way is to buy it from the Miyoo official store on AliExpress. This is going to cost around $65 with free shipping, but just bear in mind it's going to ship out of China, so it might take a few weeks to actually get to you. If you'd like the convenience of using Amazon, it's also available there. It's going to be a little bit more expensive, somewhere between like $60 and $80, but you'll have much faster shipping and also easy returns. Also, some of these Amazon listings will have additional perks. For example, this one comes with a hardshell case. And of course, I'll leave links to all this stuff down below as well as in my written guide. And then finally, if you live in Europe or the UK, I would recommend checking out Droids. These folks are based out of the UK, and so often their shipping is going to be faster and cheaper from there. Anyway, let's go ahead and unbox a Miyoo Mini Plus and see what kind of things we can find inside. And the contents are going to vary depending on where you bought it from, but let's go over some of these standards. The first is going to be the USB-C cable. And of note here, the best way to charge a Miyoo Mini Plus is using a standard USB-A to USB-C cable like this. If you try to use a more fancy C-to-C cable or plug, oftentimes they won't work. So generally, it's better to use an older charger or plug it directly into your computer to make sure that you're giving the correct amount of juice to the device. Now also in the box, you'll probably get a micro SD card reader, and this will be handy when you need to access the SD card from your computer. Now the one they ship is going to be pretty cheap, and so often these things will fail and they'll have slower transfer speeds. And so if you don't have one already, I would recommend upgrading to a better micro SD card reader. Currently, I've been using this one from Anker. This one's a little bit fancy, it's about 20 bucks. But it's got all the bells and whistles that I'm looking for. For example, it will read both micro SD cards and regular SD cards, but you can also connect it to your computer in two different ways, including USB-C and USB-A. Also in the box, you might get a screen protector, and this one's pretty self-explanatory. And you're also going to get an instruction manual that will talk about some of the ins and outs of the stock operating system. And then finally, the other thing that ships with most of these Miyoo Mini Plus devices is going to be an SD card that's going to be preloaded with a bunch of games. Now the size of the card might depend on where you bought it from, but generally it's going to be between 32 and 64 gigabytes. These are going to be cheap generic SD cards, and we'll talk more about these later in the video. For now, let's go ahead and start up the device and talk about the operating system that ships with it, or what we like to call the stock operating system. And really, for the most part, the stock system on this device is not half bad. You have the ability to go through your most recently played files, and you can also make a favorites list if you want to access your very favorite games. But the majority of your time is probably going to be spent in the game menu. This is where you can pick your various systems and then choose your game and then boot them from there. And like I mentioned before, your micro SD card is likely going to be preloaded with a bunch of games. And there are going to be a ton on here, probably way more than you can play. For example, there are almost 1,500 Super Nintendo games on here alone. Anyway, to start up a game, you just press the A button, and after a moment, the game will start right up. Now, after you're done playing the game, the next thing you want to do is press that menu button here in the center of the device. This is going to bring up a quick menu with a bunch of different options, including a save state function. This means it'll save exactly where you are in the game so you can access it later. Some other options include the native menu, which is going to be the emulator settings. And there's also a net play function, but to be honest, it doesn't really work in the stock operating system. And then finally, once you want to exit the game, you would just select that from the menu on the bottom. Now, another thing you can do within the games menu is press the menu button. This will allow you to add a game to your favorites or even delete it if you'd like. And so even though there are a ton of games on this system, this is what I would recommend to better organize it, to put all your very favorites in the favorites menu. Next, I want to take a look at the other functions of the stock operating system. And the next function is called RetroArch. Within here, you'll find a bunch more advanced emulators. And so if you don't see your favorite game system within the regular games menu, then I would recommend checking out in here. Just bear in mind that some of these are a little bit on the buggy side, and so you may not have the best experience overall. Further to the right, we have our apps section. This is going to be a bunch of standalone apps and games. But bear in mind that some of these games might be in Chinese, so they may not be very fun to play. And then finally, in the last section, we have our settings. Here we can do things like adjust the brightness, turn on our Wi-Fi, and then also adjust the color and saturation of the screen. You've also got a couple other basic functions like changing out the menu language, but really when it comes down to it, that's about it for the stock operating system. It's pretty simple, but we can definitely make it better. So next we're going to install OnionOS, but before we do that, I want to back up all of those game files that we saw on that SD card. So in this next section, I'm going to show you how to take all of those BIOS or system files as well as ROMs or game files and put them somewhere safe. Now before we do that, one note here is that I'm going to be using Windows as our standard operating system when we're on our computer. If you're a Mac user, I have all those instructions listed in my written guide, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume you're on a Windows machine. Anyway, when you first plug in your microSD card, this is what the file system is going to look like. So first thing we want to do is set up a place on our computer where we can actually put these files. So here you can see that on my desktop, I've created a folder named Miyoo, and that's where we're going to put everything. So my Miyoo folder is going to be on the left, and then my microSD card is going to be on the right. So the first thing we want to back up are BIOS files. These are going to be system files that are required for certain emulators to run properly. And because they're already preloaded on this card, it's a lot easier to grab them from here as opposed to searching on the internet for them. And to find them, we're going to go into the RetroArch folder, and then you should see another folder called .retroarch. And if you don't see this folder, go up to your View menu and make sure that Hidden Items is turned on. Anyway, within the .retroarch folder, you will find another folder called System, and within here is going to be the entire BIOS pack. In fact, this is just a generic collection of a bunch of different BIOS files, including systems that don't even run on the Miyoo Mini Plus. So what I would recommend doing is actually just grabbing all of these and then moving them over onto your computer. The vast majority of these you won't actually need on this specific device, but you can use these BIOS files for other emulators in the future. And later in the video, I'll show you the exact BIOS files you're going to need in case you only want to grab those. So what I'm going to do in my Miyoo folder, I'm going to make a new folder called BIOS. And now I'm going to move over all of these files into this folder. And it's going to take a few minutes to back these up, so go ahead and grab a snack and drink while you're waiting. And once this transfer is complete, we're ready to move over our game files. And you're going to find these under the ROMs folder. And here you've got a couple choices. You can either just move these folders over to your computer wholesale, or you can actually dive into each of these folders and then grab these ROMs individually. So for example, under the SFC folder, which is for Super Nintendo, you can find a bunch of different Super Nintendo games. And within here, you can either back up all of them or just choose your favorites. Anyway, that's really about it when it comes to backing up your BIOS and ROMs files. It's a matter of just grabbing that SD card and then moving your files over to your computer. And of course, if you already have your own ROM library, I would recommend using that one instead. Anyway, once you've got a good game collection going, you're ready to start installing OnionOS. Now, the first thing I would recommend here is actually getting a better SD card than the one that comes with the device. And in general, I would recommend getting a card from a more reputable brand, something like SanDisk or Samsung. And for me personally, I found that 32 gigabytes is the optimal size for the Miyoo Mini Plus. That's going to give me plenty of space to store a bunch of different games. And for me personally, I like to have a more trim list. That way it ensures that I'm going to play all of those games. And a 32 gigabyte card will cost you about $10 on Amazon, and you can definitely go higher, but just bear in mind that prices will increase depending on how large you go. Anyway, we're going to stick with a 32 gigabyte card for this video, and so let's load it up with the Onion operating system. And for this, we're going to go to the Onion website, and like with all the other links, it'll be in my written guide. Now, there's actually two different versions of Onion that we can install and a couple different ways that we can install it. The standard installation is going to be manually using the most stable version here on the left. And as of making this video, it is version 4.2.3. Now to install this manually, all you'd have to do is grab the zip file, extract it, and then put the contents in your SD card. And I have instructions on how to do that in my written guide, but we're not going to do that in this video. We're going to do something even easier. Now, in addition to the stable version on the left, there's also a beta version that you can install on the right. This is going to be a more updated but experimental version of the operating system, so it might have a couple bugs here and there. Anyway, the manual installation process is going to be exactly the same. You would grab the zip file, extract it, then put the contents in the SD card. But like I just said, we're not going to do the manual installation. We're going to do something even better. And for this, we're going to try an application called Onion Desktop Tools. And you can actually find the link for it directly below the links we were just clicking on. So from here, just go ahead and click on that link, and then you'll see another link that says Download Onion Desktop Tools. And from here, it's going to download a zip file. Once you have it downloaded, we're going to extract this file. You can either use 7-zip or the built-in extractor from Windows. Either way, once you're done, you'll have a folder with a bunch of files inside. And it might look intimidating at first, but trust me, this is very simple. All we need to do is open up the batch file that says Onion Desktop Tools Launcher with Console. And when you first click on it, it's going to ask, do you really want to open this? And you're going to say, yeah, man, I want to do it. And after a moment, you're going to see this nice user interface here on the screen. Now, the Onion Desktop Tools is actually a very robust program. There are a bunch of different configuration things you can do within this app. But we're going to use this app for the most basic of purposes. We're going to format the SD card to make sure it's in FAT32 file format. And then this tool will also download and install OnionOS for us. So in the menu, we're going to select the middle option, Format SD Card and Install Onion, and then we're going to press OK. Now I've already plugged in my 32GB card, and you can see it here on the screen. And so I'm going to select it and then press OK. After that, you're going to get a couple pop-up warnings, just making sure that this is the card that you want to format. And I'm just going to press, yeah, man, I want to do it to get through these screens. And after a moment, it's going to format your card to FAT32, which is a requirement for this device. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why I like this tool so much. If you try to get an SD card that's larger than 32GB, by default, it's not going to be formatted to FAT32. So instead, you'll have to use a third-party app like this one here. But the nice thing about Onion Desktop Tools is that it does everything for you without having to install that third-party app. Anyway, once your card has been formatted, you'll get a new screen here that's going to give you the different options of Onion that you can download. And so just like how it was with their website, we can choose between the stable or the more recent beta version. Personally, I like to live on the edge, so we're going to install the beta version right now. It's going to take a few minutes to download, but once it's done, it's going to ask which version you want to install. And of course, it's going to be the one we just downloaded, so I'm going to select that and then press OK. It's going to give you another confirmation window. We're going to click through it. And from there, it's going to extract and install OnionOS directly onto your SD card. And once it's done, the little dialog box on the right of the window will tell you that everything is good. So now we can close out of this app, eject the SD card from our computer, and then plug it into the Miyoo Mini Plus. Now, installation of OnionOS is super easy. We're going to put the card into our device and then power it on, and then it'll take a couple minutes to initialize the installation. After that, it's going to walk you through a couple features of the operating system itself, and it'll also give you a diagram of the various hotkeys or shortcuts you can use on the device. And most of these will be enabled by pressing the menu button first. So for example, if we want to fast forward while playing a game, we're going to hold the menu button and then press R1. And so that's what this diagram is kind of walking you through. Anyway, once you get through these initial screens, you're going to be greeted with this section right here, which is called the Package Manager. Within here, we can choose all the different emulators and apps that we want to install on the Miyoo Mini Plus. So I would recommend scrolling through all these various systems, and once you find one that you do want to play on the Miyoo Mini Plus, just make sure you turn it on. Now, if you want to add one of these systems later on, you can also do that too, so this is not a one single binding contract. Now, in addition to the standard emulators, there are other options we can choose from. If we press the R1 button, it'll tab over to the Apps tab. And here are a bunch of different apps that are tailor-made for OnionOS. For example, within here, you can find an ebook reader, a music player, and so on. One of my favorites is to turn on the Onion over-the-air update. This allows us to update this system just over Wi-Fi. And then finally, if we press the R1 button again, we can go into the Expert tab. And here will be a bunch of advanced or experimental emulators if you want to try these out as well. Anyway, once you're ready to install everything, just press the Start button and the installation process will begin. This will also take a couple minutes to set up, but once it's done, you'll be greeted with the main OnionOS interface. And honestly, it looks a lot like the stock operating system menu, but is quite a bit more robust. However, if we go into the games section and try to pull up a game, you'll find that everything is empty. And that's because we haven't added all of our games yet, so let's go ahead and do that next. We're going to press and hold the power button to power down the device, and then eject our SD card and put it back into our computer. And now when we open up our SD card on our computer, we're going to see a bunch of different folders. And the first one we're going to go to is the BIOS folder. Now on the left side, I'm going to pull up my old Miyoo folder, which had that BIOS backup that we made earlier. And like I mentioned before, you could just grab all of these and then move them over if you'd like. However, this whole collection is like half a gigabyte, and so you may not want to take up that much space on your card. So here I'm going to show you the specific BIOS files that you can move over, and a lot of these are very small. So let me go ahead and move them over right now real quick, and then we'll talk about each of them in order. Okay, so here on the right are the main BIOS files that you're going to need for most of these standard systems. These three right here are for Sega CD, so if you want to play those games, move these over. The next three are going to be for Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, and Game Boy Color. Now by default, these three are not going to be necessary, but if you do add them, you will get the BIOS boot logo. And personally, I love seeing that, so I'm going to add these as well. Next up is going to be the Neo Geo BIOS file. Now this one's tricky. You need to add it both to the BIOS folder right here, and then also into your Neo Geo ROMs folder. That's going to make sure that all of these games are going to run just fine. After that, we have a PlayStation 1 BIOS. This is also necessary for many games. And then finally, we have our PC Engine CD or TurboGrafx CD BIOS. And honestly, that's all you're really going to need for the majority of the systems that you want to play on this device. Now, if you want to play some more obscure systems, many of those may require BIOS files, and I'll show you how to find those later in this video. Anyway, now that we've moved over our BIOS files, we're ready to start moving over our ROMs or game files. And you probably guessed it already, but you're going to be able to put these within the ROMs folder. And once you open it up, there will be a bunch of subfolders, and each of these are going to correspond to a different game system. And you'll find that the only folders that show up are the ones that you actually activated when you installed OnionOS. And so even though Onion can play a lot more systems than what you see here, it's only showing the ones that I actually installed. And so now I'm going to move over ROM files from my own collection over onto the OnionOS SD card. So here on the left are all of my NES ROMs, and I'm going to move those over onto the SD card on the right. And the file names for some of these folders are going to be a little bit weird. For example, NES is actually FC for Famicom. Anyway, it's really going to be just a matter of drag and drop once you have your own ROM library. And like I mentioned before, you can either get these ROMs from the old SD card that came with the device, or if you have your own ROM library collection like I do, you can just move them over from there. Now, even though this step is pretty simple, it's one of the places where a lot of newcomers get hung up. And so if you get confused in this part, let me give you one more resource. Back on that Onion website, if we go into the docs page, here you can find just about anything related to OnionOS, including a listing of all the features, as well as a more in-depth installation guide. But for the purposes of this video, the section we're going to focus on here is the emulator section. And here you'll find a page for every single system that can play on OnionOS. So all you have to do is just kind of drill down through this menu, find this system that you're trying to run, and then when you click on the page, it's going to give you all the information you need. It's going to list out the name of the ROM folder, all the file extensions that are accepted, and it'll also tell you whether or not any BIOS files are required, and then any other nuances related to this one particular system. So if you're not quite sure where to put your games or what game files you can specifically use, I would recommend checking out this resource. Now, one of the questions I get the most has to do with arcade systems, and luckily the Onion website also has this covered. So for example, the default arcade emulator for OnionOS is called MAME, and if we go to this page, it's going to explain everything that we need to get this set up. Now, the most important part when it comes to getting arcade working is to use the exact same ROM set that's required for the emulator. And thankfully, the Onion team has actually listed out the exact ROM set that you need. So you didn't hear this from me, but if you search this exact phrase right here in Google, you'll be able to find the archive that you need when it comes to finding those specific games. Anyway, once you've moved over all your ROM files into the corresponding folder, we're ready to get started. So we're going to put the SD card back into our device. And now when we go into that games folder, if we go into any of these systems, we can now see our games. Now to start up a game, we just press the A button, and let's start with Game Boy. There's a couple things going on right here and now. And the first thing you'll see is the original Game Boy boot logo. And that's because I added those Game Boy BIOS files. This is why we're seeing it. In addition, you can see it has a nice green colorization to the screen. And the Onion team has already pre-configured most of these emulators for you so you can get the best experience possible right when you start it up. Anyway, once you're done playing a game, we're going to press the menu button. This is going to take us into a new menu called the game switcher. Now, because we only have started one game so far, we don't have anything else within here, so let's press the B button to back out to the main menu. And now we'll go back through and pick another game. Let's do a Game Boy Advance game this time. And when we start up a game, you can see the Game Boy Advance boot logo. And again, this is because we added the Game Boy Advance BIOS file. Anyway, once you have a game started, we can press the menu button again and it'll bring us back to the game switcher. And now we can switch between the available games. And the best thing is that once we start up this game, it's going to go back to where we were when we first closed out of it. So it's kind of like an autosave or a suspend mode. It's really handy. And as you can imagine, the more games that you play, the more games will show up in Game Switcher. And so you're going to have a whole library of your favorite games that you can swap in and out of as you please. And this is definitely one of the big strengths of OnionOS. Okay, a couple other more basic things to talk about. If you press the select button within a game menu, you can choose to add a game to your favorites, much like how it was with the stock operating system. In addition, if we go into the apps section, we'll see all those different apps that we installed previously, and some of these are really handy. For example, the themes menu will allow you to go through a bunch of different Onion themes, and so if you want to change the look and feel of OnionOS, this is where you would do it. Finally, one other thing to mention, when you're in a game, if you press and hold the power button, it's actually going to save where you were and then close the system down. And now the next time you power on the device, it's actually going to open up exactly where you were in that previous game. Now, those are the more basic features of OnionOS, so let's talk about some of the more advanced functions that we have as well. To start, if we go into the settings menu, you'll see it is exactly like the stock operating system. And within here, we can connect to our local Wi-Fi network. Now, I'm not going to do that right now because I don't want to show you my password, but once we have that set up, there's quite a few things we can do online with the Miyoo Mini Plus. For example, within the game menu, if you press the Y button, it'll bring up the GLO, or Game List option. And at the bottom, there's an option that's called Scraper. And this will allow us to add box art to our menu. Now to start, you're going to need a username and password for screenscraper.fr. And this is super simple. You just click on the register button on the top right, and then make your own username and password, and it's going to be totally free. After that, you'll go into the configuration menu and add your username and password, and from there you can select to scrape all of your ROMs. And this will take a few minutes, but it's going to go through all your file names and then compare them against game databases. And if there's a match, it's going to download the box art that corresponds to that game. Just bear in mind that if you're using something a little bit more unconventional, like a ROM hack, or your game file is not named correctly, then you might get an error here or there. Anyway, once that's done, you can now navigate through your system and it'll show a little box art on the right side. And there are ways to customize the box art and everything else. It's a little bit more advanced for this guide, but you can learn how to do that within the Onion website. Another thing you can do once connected to the menu is go into the apps and then select Onion over-the-air update. And this is going to go back to their GitHub page and then look for the most recent stable or beta version of their software. And so once you have everything set up from here on out, you never really need to plug this into a computer. You can update the operating system right here, and you can even transfer your files wirelessly once you set that up. And then finally, the last thing I want to show off are retro achievements. You can access these by going into apps and then RetroArch. And then once you're in the RetroArch menu, we're going to scroll down to settings and then navigate near the bottom. You'll see a section called achievements. And once you're here, you want to turn on achievements, and then it's going to ask you to enter your username and password. We're going to have to go to a different website to set up this as well. And this you can find at retroachievements.org. Again, it's going to be totally free, but here you would sign up and get a username and password. And then within RetroArch, just go ahead and input that username and password right here. After that, press the B button to back out to the main menu, and then go into Configuration File and select Save Current Configuration. And that's it. Once you're done, you now have retro achievements enabled for the Miyoo Mini Plus. Now, anytime you start up a game, you'll see a little dialog on the bottom that says that you have logged into retro achievements, and it will also tell you how many achievements you've earned for each of those games. However, bear in mind that you need to be online with your device in order to earn retro achievements. They're not something that you could earn offline. Now, there are a lot more advanced features within Onion, and so I'm going to direct you back to the Onion website. And again, within that docs section, you're going to find a bunch of different guides. And some of these are pretty awesome. For example, there's a ports collection. And here you can install a bunch of standalone games that will run natively on the Miyoo Mini Plus. That's going to include things like Diablo and Doom and Duke Nukem and Quake. In addition, because this device is online capable, you can also play multiplayer with the Miyoo Mini Plus. And again, the Onion website will walk you through this entire process. In fact, I've done a couple Miyoo Mini Plus multiplayer videos already, and those are also going to be linked in my written guide. Another place worth checking out is going to be the app section. Here you can read up more about the included apps that come with OnionOS. So if you're not quite sure how a specific app works or how to get the most out of it, you can read about it here. In addition, they have a section called Community Apps. These are going to be more advanced apps that aren't available natively on the device but can be installed. Here you can do things like adjust the boot logo on the device, and even set up things like Spotify and cloud saves. Another place worth checking out is going to be the Onion theme section. So if you don't like the 24 themes that they have by default, there's a whole repository of other themes, including instructions how to make your own. And finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to OnionOS is the firmware on the device. Now, I get that it's confusing. OnionOS is an operating system, and then there's also a firmware. And I would say to think of the firmware like the back end of the device. OnionOS is really just the front end that you're interacting with. Anyway, my point here is that if you're running a very old firmware, something that's from like March of 2023, you will have to update it in order to get OnionOS to work. Now, in this day and age, it's very rare to find one that's so old, and the way you would check is to go into these settings and then check the device info, and it'll show you the date of the firmware. And what you need here is a firmware that's been updated at least from May of 2023. If it's older than that, you will have to upgrade it. And I've got the full instructions on how to update the firmware on my written guide. But like I said, it's going to be pretty rare if you get a Miyoo Mini Plus that has an older firmware. And the firmware update process is very simple nowadays. All you have to do is go to the Onion website, and then here at the bottom, you can download the most recent version of the firmware, and then you just want to extract that zip file, put the file inside the root directory of your SD card, and then put the SD card back in the device, and then plug in your power cable. And from there, it's going to initiate the firmware update process, and this will take a couple minutes, and once it's done, you're good to go. After that, just put your SD card back into the computer and delete that firmware file. And again, like I mentioned, it's going to be pretty rare that you actually have to do this, but I did want to leave these instructions in here in case you get stuck at this one part. And like I said, everything is step by step in my written guide. Okay, now that we know the ins and outs of OnionOS, we're going to talk about another custom operating system called MinUI. And this one is really fun too, but a lot more simplified, and I think that actually has its own strengths. In fact, the simplicity of MinUI is one of the hallmarks of this operating system. And for me personally, I found this is the ideal operating system when I'm making a Miyoo Mini Plus for a gift. Because I found that I can give this to a child, an old person, anyone, and they can really kind of figure out how to make it work. Now, one limitation of MinUI is that it has a very small list of games that can actually be played on it. And we have two different lists to choose from. We have the base and the extras. As you can see from the base list, it's just going to be your standard systems like Game Boy, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, things like that. One thing of note, the Sega Genesis that they have listed here also includes Sega CD and 32X. Now there's also an extras list, and here we have a couple more systems that you can choose from, but again, like I mentioned, it's not going to have every system under the sun. It's really going to be most of the classics. Anyway, we're going to install MinUI on this device as well, just to give you an idea of what it's going to be like. And because everything resides on the SD card, it's really easy to swap between the two. You just need two different SD cards. Anyway, to install MinUI, we're going to go to their GitHub page, and then we're going to click on the Releases tab on the right. This will bring us to the most recent release, and you'll find two different zip files you can choose from. And these are going to be the base and extras files that we were just talking about before. And just to make things simple, we're going to download both, and I'm going to show you how to install them both as well. And this is a very easy process. It's really just drag and drop. Anyway, now that we've downloaded those two zip files, we're ready to actually move them over to an SD card. And it's going to be the same thing here. We want a blank SD card, and I would also make sure that it's formatted to FAT32. So on the left here, we have our blank micro SD card, and on the right, we have our two zip files. And to install, we just have to open up the base zip file, and then move all of these contents over onto the micro SD. And like I mentioned before, if you want to also install those extra emulators, we're going to open up that zip folder and then move over everything except for the README file. And this is also drag and drop, but it is going to take a couple minutes to install. Now, if you run into any questions or problems, I would recommend reading the README files that come with either of these zip files. Within here, it'll talk about what MinUI is and how to install it, and it'll also give you a handy list of all the BIOS files that are required for each of these systems. And the BIOS requirements are just a little bit different than OnionOS, so if you are running into any problems, I would recommend reading that file. After that, all we have to do is just add our game files. Again, this is going to be very simple. We're going to go into the ROMs folder. You'll find all your different systems, and from there, you can drag and drop your ROM files into the corresponding corresponding folder. And again, this is very similar to the OnionOS setup that we just did earlier. And once we've moved over our games and BIOS files, we're ready to go. So we're going to eject our SD card, put it back into the device. And now when we power on the device, it's going to say installing MinUI. And then after a moment, you will see the MinUI interface. And like I mentioned before, this is a very simple user experience. Everything is going to be text-based, and it's very intuitive. You pick your system, pick your game, and then boot it right up. Like with OnionOS, everything is going to be pre-configured to optimal settings, and to get into the submenu, all you have to do is press that menu button in the center of the device. And the options here are also very familiar. You can do a save state, so you can save your game directly where it was, and this is also where you can load it up to resume where you were. And also within the options menu, we've got all the different configuration options that we would ever need. But the beauty of MinUI is that you don't actually have to go in here if you don't want to. However, if you know your way around emulation, you will find that most of the configurations you want to make are here. So here you can adjust things like aspect ratio or the controls, and you can even configure your own custom hotkeys for each system. So I think that's one of the things I really like about MinUI, is that you don't have to go into these settings if you don't want to, but they are there if you want to use them. And the other thing I love about the MinUI interface is that it's super snappy. For example, you can switch between your different systems and games much more quickly than both in the stock operating system and within OnionOS. So if you're looking for something very simple and bare bones but feature rich, then I would recommend checking out MinUI. This one also has some really great quick save features too. So if you're in a game, you can power down, it's going to make a quick save and then power off. And same thing here, if you power it back on, it's going to go right back to where you were before. So if you want to learn more about MinUI or try it out yourself, then I would recommend checking out my written guide for all those links. Okay, and the last section I want to talk about here are the various accessories and mods that I recommend for the Miyoo Mini Plus. And you might be surprised to find that the best way to find most of these products are actually going to be on Etsy. This device is so popular within the community that there are a lot of grassroots movements to improve the experience. So we're going to start by talking about some of my favorite cases, and by far my favorite one is this one here called the Miyoo Mini Plus hardshell case. And these are 3D printed cases that are made with attention to detail and a lot of love and care. Now I've been slacking on buying new cases for my Miyoo Mini Plus, but I do happen to have one for the original Miyoo Mini. This one's a little bit smaller, but you can get a good idea of the quality right here. The inside has a nice soft foam lining to it, and the outside is a perfect fit for your device. And I've also found it to be very rugged, so when I'm going on travel, this is usually the case that I use for my original Miyoo Mini. And Yumi Retro has a bunch of different 3D printed cases, including this one for the Ambernic RG Nano. And she even personalized this one for me and put Random Indie Game 3 right here. And this is an old joke on this channel when I used to pretend that I didn't know what Mario Bros. 3 was. Anyway, yes, if you're looking for a hardshell case, I think that the Yumi Retro ones are the best, and I'll have this linked in the video description. Now, if you want something a little bit more bare bones, then I recommend this one from Epic Printing Shop. This one is an articulating screen protector, so it doesn't cover the back of the device. Instead, it really just covers the buttons and the screen. Now, like I mentioned, I've been really slacking on my Miyoo Mini Plus cases, but I do happen to have the same one, but for the Ambernic RG35XX. And there's a couple hidden features of this one. When you unlatch it and then put it to the back of the device, it gives you space for your back buttons, but then also there's a little shelf on the bottom for your other fingers. And when closing it up, it gives you a very satisfying click. So if you're looking for something a little bit more bare bones, this is a great solution as well. Now, if you want to get a really fancy or personalized case, then I would recommend this one from Death Rattler. And these are leather cases that are customizable. And here you get an option of different colors as well as stitching, and you can also DM the seller to have different things printed on the front. Now, I don't have one for the Miyoo Mini Plus, but I did buy one for my original Miyoo Mini, and I love this one too. As you can see, it's stamped with Retro Game Core, and the seller even personalized the little coin button on the front as well. So if you want a nice fancy case, I think this one's pretty cool as well. Next, let's talk about a couple of the mod options we have for the Miyoo Mini Plus. And I think your number one source is going to be Sakura Retro Modding. Here they have over 40 different listings of things that you can do to personalize your Miyoo Mini Plus experience. That'll include everything from stickers that you can put on the front of the device, as well as different D-pad styles and different colored buttons too. And I've used a couple of these before, especially with my original Miyoo Mini. As you can see, this one has the PlayStation style buttons, and these are really high quality. In addition, on the back, I have a little PlayStation logo sticker that looks pretty cool too. And finally, the last mod I would recommend is actually these back buttons right here. And these are made by a shop called Get Better Buttons. settings. These are available for both the Miyoo Mini and Miyoo Mini Plus and a couple other devices, and these really improve the ergonomics. So if you don't like the feel of them on the Miyoo Mini Plus, this is what I would recommend swapping them out for. And I'll leave all this stuff linked down below in case you want to support these community sellers. Anyway, that's really about it for this video. I know it was quite long, but I wanted to make sure I covered every single aspect of the Miyoo Mini Plus. Like I mentioned in the beginning, this is kind of a perfect storm of a device. It's really great to use, but then also is a great value as well. And so I'm hoping this video will help you get the most out of this device if you do happen to pick one up. So if you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below, and like I mentioned, there's a full written guide, so if you want to walk through this step by step in written form, it's all going to be linked in the video description. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.